Well, thank you, everybody from Nevada. This is Glenn Tapia from ACJI in Colorado. Thanks for gathering today. Um, Chief Carpenter and Captain Lesko, I really appreciate an opportunity to share this information with you all. This is really important stuff to leading organizational change, and big kudos to you all for gathering your folks and spending some time with us via webinar. In case you've just joined, just a couple logistical things. I'll be going through the presentation today, and we're going to be recording it. So if you would like a copy of the recording afterwards, we're happy to give you one. I'm going to ask you to send questions today through the chat tool on the webinar format, and I will address all those questions at the end of the presentation. The presentation today is somewhere close to 2 hours, and I will entertain all questions at the end. That way we can address all those in a timely way. So thanks everybody for joining. So today we will be talking about the 10 essential principles of real-world implementation leadership. And I will be sharing some information with you about leading change in the real world. And it's a little bit provocative. It's real world and it's grounded in real world experiences. And so sometimes I get pretty passionate about this material, and I might ask for your forgiveness in the event that I get pretty passionate and as we go through this. So the 10 essential principles are based on some experiences that I've had over time. And I'm just gonna kind of lay a basic framework for you to just let you know a little bit about where I've come from with our experience here in Colorado with organizational change. And it comes from starting in the early 1990s. Our legislature brought risk and need assessment into the community-based correction system in our state. And that's about when we adopted risk assessment from Canada in the early 90s. There was a law passed essentially to standardize substance abuse treatment and standardized assessment. And so we brought on the risk need assessment format from Canada in the early 1990s. And the idea there was to reduce recidivism. And we thought that was going to really result in great organizational change. Into the mid and late 1990s, as we were purveying the risk need assessment throughout the community-based supervision system in Colorado, Vonta Andrews really started purveying the R&R model, or risk need responsivity, throughout the United States. That had originated in Canada, and for us, we started purveying it throughout our system in 1990s. About 2003 or 2004, right around then, we realized that about the time that the National Institute of Corrections came out with the principles of effective intervention for risk reduction and recidivism reduction, the words evidence-based practice came into our nomenclature in Colorado. And we realized at the time then that there was much more to do than just risk need assessment. We found out over time that people were doing risk need assessments, but it was more of a task than a process. And because it was viewed more as a task and not so much of a process, and not linked to any other formal risk reduction strategies, in and of itself, it didn't really bend the curve on reducing recidivism. So in that period of 2003 and 2004, Dr. Faye Taxman published a document called The Tools of the Trade, and it was all the research that we had at the time around reducing risk and recidivism. And we decided to adopt these principles into our system. And we thought that was going to give us organizational change by adopting a much broader framework for risk and recidivism reduction outside of just risk and need assessment. About 2010, we stumbled onto this concept of implementation science. There's an organization called the National Implementation Research Network that we linked up with and brought implementation science into our system in the EBP era, what I call the EBP era. The idea was that it's not just good enough to have good risk reduction and science behind what we do in reducing risk and recidivism, but we also have to have science behind our implementation strategies. And so as we were purveying motivational interviewing throughout the state and implementing motivational interviewing in every probation district in our state and many parole agencies and community corrections and behavioral health agencies, We're applying implementation science because we realized that we have to have good science in those strategies. Here we are in 2019, about to go into 2020, and we're still working on organizational change. And so my framework today comes to you from change leadership starting in the early 2003 era, using implementation science for almost a decade, and sharing with you the real world experiences of applying implementation science to the criminal justice system and really trying to work towards organizational change. Throughout the presentation, you will see the metaphor of a butterfly for representing organizational change, and that's very intentional. And I'll share the why with you behind that metaphor in just a little bit. So what I've learned is that organizations and systems are perfectly designed to achieve the outcomes that we get. If you really think about that for a second, take a look at your outcomes and think first about your practices, but then we have to start thinking about the organization and the system within the organization. The idea is your outcomes are a perfect reflection of the way that your organization changes. What do we know from the research? The research tells us that about 70% of top-down change initiatives fail. Harvard would call that theory E type of change. And so that's the kind of change that you can imagine, you know, the executive director of a department or the legislature or the governor's office or the chief probation officer or something like that wants to implement some change and does it from a top-down perspective. And the research at large says that those change initiatives fail more often than they succeed. We've also learned that theory O, which is bottom-up change initiatives, also fail. Theory O, or bottom-up change, is kind of grassroots change. Say, for example, staff go, say a training staff or a training member goes to a conference, learns about something really exciting, decides to bring that into the organization, maybe writes a grant, and we try to affect change kind of from the staff level up. And those have very high failure rates, organizationally speaking. And we also know that about 2/3 or better of critical mass change initiatives fail. And critical mass is essentially when you try to get enough people in an organization or in a system to change to kind of tip the scales. And those change initiatives have very high failure rates too. What do we do? No matter how we implement change, we fail more often than we succeed at organizations in general. A lot of that is because traditional implementation looks like the image that you see on the screen. You'll see on the screen, there's a dude looking at some science, which is all this gobbledygook to the left, and they're trying to get the outcomes, which is all this scientific gobbledygook to the right. And then in the middle, we expect a miracle to happen. So the idea is, if we're going to apply science to get better outcomes, we have to apply science in the middle. Often what we do when we implement, we take what I call sometimes these two-step change methods or implementation methods. The first is persuade and repeat, 2 steps. Step 1, persuade, step 2, repeat. And that is essentially when, maybe we go to a conference and we're persuaded that we need to change or persuaded to implement something. We go back into our organizations and we try to persuade other people to change and really try to do what's essentially equates to transformational leadership and persuade other people to change. And we keep repeating that cycle. Maybe we even go back to the same conference a couple years later. We're re-energized about that change and we try to use persuasion in our organizations to change. Very high failure rates with that 2-step method. The most popular method is what I call train and pray. And everybody knows what this is like. This is when you go to a class and you learn for a couple days on how to do the new thing, the evidence-based practice. And then we pray that you implement it with fidelity and to enough scale that it's going to bend the curve on our outcomes. The idea here is that training in and of itself is not an effective implementation strategy. More often than not, people don't retain what they learn in a classroom setting. Generally speaking, and in very round numbers, people will only retain 20% of what they learn in the classroom setting, and over time, what they retain will further be eroded to even smaller numbers over time. So that doesn't really get into organizational practices and skill building and things like that. And that's a very familiar change strategy that we often take. Over the years, we've realized that we need to do more than train and pray. So then we kind of take the next step, which is still a two-step method, which is we're going to get real serious about change and we're going to put it in policy and procedure. So we put change into our policies and our procedures. Maybe we put it into our administrative regulations or our performance improvement plans or performance measures or things like that. But essentially it gets to paper and not practice. The idea here is that these two-step models do not work. And even with these two-step models, we still don't get good success rates in organizational change and in implementation. So when we look at the implementation science, we find out that only 14% of new scientific discoveries enter into day-to-day practice. 14%. Now in the criminal justice system, I've seen numbers even smaller than 14%. I've seen 5%, I've seen 8%, I've seen 10%. So organizations at large have high failure rates, say 70%. The implementation research tells us around 10 to 14%. So we have a lot of work to do in how to get implementation aligned with the science. But if you think of it this way, that there's a gap sometimes in our services and what the science says. And a lot of us as implementation leaders are trying to close that gap. And so the idea here is that whatever we do with our criminal justice system or our offender serving system or our behavioral health system, whatever we're working with, that we want to close this gap with bringing science into our practices. And that's where things like criminology and behavioral health research and things like that help us close the gap between what we do in our day-to-day practices and what the science says that we do. The other gap, a bigger gap and a more difficult gap, is the implementation gap. And that is essentially is what we're doing to close the science to service gap done with fidelity. Are we doing it for long enough time? And are we doing it with enough quality? The idea with closing the implementation gap is we really need those three attributes to make sure that we're implementing good, effective risk reduction or change strategies. Again, quality is, are we doing it with fidelity and doing it right? Time is, are we doing it for long enough? And density is, are we doing it on a large enough scale? So say we're talking an offender population or a probation system or a parole system, we need to do it with enough offenders, that's density. We need to do it with enough time, and we need to do it with enough quality. And oftentimes we neglect one or two of those things. What I've learned in closing that gap with implementation science is there's another gap, and that's the leadership and culture gap. And that's a very difficult gap to deal with. Because what I've learned is that our leadership strategies and our organizational change strategies in and of themselves might not be hospitable to using good implementation science. And we need implementation science to implement the evidence-based practice. So today we're going to be talking about how to close that leadership gap, and perhaps at another time we can talk about the culture gap. I will be talking about organizational culture gap today to some degree, but there's a lot to learn about that organizational culture gap. So what I'm going to present to you are the idea that we're often told that real world leadership looks like this. You know, we get these images of some person out front and everybody else is following that person in one direction, and it's really clean and neat and orderly and linear. And that's what we're sold as what leadership looks like. We read a leadership book or we go to an inspirational leadership seminar or something like that, and we get this illusion that leadership looks like that. Now in the real world, this is what leadership feels like. This is what real world change leadership feels like. It's chaos, it's difficult, it's messy, it's arduous. And today we're going to be talking about the real world of leadership. And I use the butterfly very intentionally as a metaphor for implementation leadership, and maybe not for the reasons that you might think. Sometimes the butterfly is known as a cliche for organizational change. And the cliche is it's inside out transformation. It's transformation from a rather basic insect into something much more beautiful and much more advanced, and it's permanent. And that's not what I'm talking about. You can see on the screen that there's an image of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And we're often led to believe that the change process is really linear, much like you see on the image on the screen. So the caterpillar goes into this cocoon and it kind of rests for a while and maybe goes to sleep or something, and then it comes out of the cocoon and it's this evolved insect and a butterfly, and it just kind of goes on about its life and does its thing. And so we get this illusion that change is really peaceful and relaxing and beautiful, and it's just not the case. Inside that cocoon, what really happens in the real world is that insect is broken down to the biochemical level. It's broken down into this kind of gelatinous mass, almost a goo, if you will. And in order for that insect to change, it has to go through a lot of pain. And that process in and of itself is the change. And so what I'm going to do is open up that cocoon and talk about what happens behind that cocoon, because that is the change. And what you will learn is that change in and of itself is not neat and pretty. And we're going to talk about the real world of real change, using the butterfly as the metaphor. But today you're going to learn the basics of 10 principles of implementation leadership. Each of these 10 principles were driven from this 10-year period of using implementation science and about 17 years of leading change in the real world. And where it came from is I had been journaling my implementation leadership experiences over this time, and I had a journal of about 150 blank pages. And over that decade, as I was documenting my experiences, I got to the end of my journal and ran out of pages, and I decided to start a new journal to keep documenting my experiences. And I decided that before I open this new journal, I'm going to go back through this old stuff and harvest what I've learned and apply it to the next period. And what I came up with was 10 principles that I learned over time. And as I have found out, the research is very much aligned with these principles of leading change. So we're going to go through these 10 principles one at a time today in really basic format. Now, just as a word of caution, these 10 principles and what I'm going to be giving you today are really a summary and a high-level overview of these 10 principles. In the real world, when we apply these principles, we have a 3-day academy that we do to give people specific tools and skills in order to apply these principles in the real world. So I'm kind of giving you a 90 to 120 minute version of essentially a 3-day academy that we do from time to time to learn these principles. The idea is that if you take these 10 principles and put them into your vocabulary in your change environment, you will be able to address the real world and arduous aspects of real world organizational change. Principle number 1 is called trust the vision. And we're taught to believe that good leadership starts with a good vision, and that, of course, is true. But the idea here is that we have to trust the vision. And the key word here is trust. And what the science tells us is there's this phenomenon in all human interactions known as the emotional contagion. And the emotional contagion is essentially from the neuroleadership world around how our attitudes are contagious with each other. It comes down to some pretty basic facts, and it really comes down to the fact that we're mammals. It's really is that simple, is that human beings are mammals and we have an effect on each other. And you can imagine for a second in your brain, try to picture a herd of deer or a herd of antelope or a herd of buffalo or something, and they're grazing in a pasture or the forest or the mountains or something, and they're all pretty relaxed and doing their thing. And as soon as one of them senses danger, what do the other ones do? They all sense the same danger. One person or one animal will see a source of danger, and all of the other ones feel that experience, and they all, as a herd, they all react to that negative experience. And that is because of the emotional contagion in mammals in the sense of the way that our brains are organized. So the emotional contagion is essentially the idea that your attitudes are contagious. even something like negative attitudes or positive attitudes, emotional intelligence, it kind of travels over our organizations like electricity in a network. And the bad thing is that it doesn't discriminate between adaptive and maladaptive emotions or behaviors. So we find that attitudes towards change and attitudes towards implementation are contagious. The idea is that the front of our brain is where we think and where we learn. That's kind of our frontal cortex. And that's when we're learning to change. But where our decisions are made in our limbic system are where we have feelings. And anytime that we confront problems or confront barriers or confront issues where we tend to see situations that are complex, we react in the same way that we react to danger, and other people react to us in the same way. So what happens is the limbic system in our brain is on an open loop system. And what that basically means is that we use external sources to manage our feelings. So if you think of something like yoga or meditation or mindfulness, and you can imagine a person who's like closing their eyes and meditating, that essentially closes the open loop system. And in those situations, when we're meditating or doing yoga or things like that, we're essentially closing external experiences that are impacting our internal feelings. And with things like mindfulness and yoga, we are essentially using our own internal system and closing that loop. But as soon as we come out of those experiences, as soon as we come out of yoga or mindfulness or whatever, our brain is in an open loop system. So it's essentially gathering information from external sources to manage internal feelings. And that open loop system actually impacts physiological changes in our body, even things like blood pressure and secreting fatty acids and how we sleep and our immune system and secretion of different hormones. And we know that moods at the leadership level travel the fastest because everybody is watching what's happening with the change leaders. So people are borrowing their emotions unintentionally, but borrowing their emotions from what's happening with leaders. And so as leaders, we have to know that whatever's happening in our brain and how we're expressing those attitudes are having a contagious effect on the people around us. And as everybody knows, people are skeptical about change. They're fatigued about change. And as leaders, we have to know that whatever we're carrying around is contagious. So what happens in this emotional contagion environment is hormones are being exchanged throughout our body, even especially in our brain, but even from our stomach, to be honest with you. And we have this hormone called cortisol, which essentially is like a stress hormone. When we have stress in times of change or implementation, cortisol is increased in our brain. And that essentially is a function that we don't have much control over immediately. Oxytocin is a hormone that is secreted when we join the herd. So if you think about that for a second, imagine situations when people are in change environments or implementation environments and things are going wrong and somebody has a stress reaction and other people join that stress reaction, and next thing you know, 10 people have that stress reaction or 20 people have that stress reaction. It's the leader's job to know that whatever's happening in that environment is contagious. So what happens is oxytocin comes in our brain and makes us feel good about joining the herd, even though we're feeling bad cortisol about the stress. So a strange thing happens. We feel good, oxytocin, about feeling bad, cortisol. It's why we have this saying of misery loves company. It makes us feel good to join stressful situations and stressful experiences with other people. In a strange way, our brain, by joining the herd, is a coping mechanism to deal with the stress. So we have to find ways to reroute this emotional contagion and reroute this network, because we can also get oxytocin responses by feeling good. We can also get oxytocin responses by experiencing optimism, relentless optimism. So the idea is that another problem that we have in mammals and with humans in general is we know that our brains lean heavy towards negative emotions. And it's, again, because we're mammals, and it's a survival mechanism, essentially. There's a lot of studies that I've read about. There was a study in particular I read about of a psychologist who was going through hundreds of studies to look at the kind of relationship of negative emotions versus positive emotions. And he started reading study by study to try to figure out how many studies identify that we lean towards positive emotions rather than negative, or vice versa. And the psychologist stopped at about 80 studies because he found, after looking at 80 studies, that most science shows us that we react stronger to negative experiences than positive. And it's known as the positive-negative asymmetry. One study in particular, he was looking at the number of words in the English language for emotions and found out that 2/3 of the words in the English language relate to negative emotions, and about a third relate to positive emotions. So what does that mean? That means, as a human culture, we have found ways over time to identify words and terms for all of our negative emotions twice as much as we have with positive emotions. So we put a lot of value in negative emotions. We pay a lot of attention to negative emotions. There was another study that I read about where a group of people were exposed to some images, and different types of images, positive and negative. For example, they're looking at crash scenes or really pleasant scenes or scenes of critical incidents. And they were tracking a couple different metrics. They were looking at how long do they look at these images, what do they remember, and what do they pay attention to. And their brains were hooked up to um, technology, I guess you can say, that looks at what's happening in the brain, in the limbic system and the frontal cortex. And what they found in this study, that people paid attention to negative images longer than they did positive images. They remembered more about the negative situations, and they remembered things for a longer period of time on the negative images that they saw. So in other words, they dismissed the positive images more often than they dismissed the negative images. Why? Because we feel emotions when we see those experiences. Many, many studies have shown that we react to negative experiences more strongly than negative. So as a change leader, we have to redirect that asymmetry. We have to at least get to 50-50, or at least flip the script on negative versus positive emotions. And that starts with our attitude. Trusting the vision basically comes from the idea that your beliefs and your attitudes and your emotions are contagious. So we have to be relentlessly optimistic as change leaders. We have to brighten the goal to our people who are following us. Now, relentless optimism does not mean everything is puppies and rainbows and everything's always going to be all right. That's not what it means. Relentless optimism means that when we start experiencing change situations and we start experiencing the stresses of change, we have to be relentlessly committed to finding optimism in our change strategies. We have to be relentlessly committed to trusting what we're doing. We have to be relentlessly committed to getting over the barriers that we have, because the attitude that we have in those situations is contagious. Imagine yourself following a leader that is pessimistic about the change initiative. What's that going to do to your attitude as a follower? Think about that for a second. So as a leader, we have to be very aware of our attitudes and our beliefs and our emotions. We have to separate the feelings of uncertainty and fear. We run into these situations all the time with implementation work where we get uncertain if something is going to work. Are people going to engage in the coaching and the training? Are we going to get to fidelity with the evidence-based practice? Are we really going to get the outcomes that we promised to the legislature or to our boss or whatever on the time frame that we promised? We're uncertain about those situations. And unfortunately, our brain likes to experience uncertainty and fear in the same place. And our brain sometimes confuses being uncertain with being scared. You can imagine in situations, for example, when you're lost in your car and you're driving somewhere and you're lost, your first reactions when you're uncertain about where you are not excitement. They're not optimism. They're fear. And so as a change leader, we have to separate those feelings in our brain that when we're in uncertain situations, we have to think about that situation and not show that we're scared. Even though we might be, we have to show that we're not scared. And we have to translate that emotion into optimism. We also have to believe that good is the enemy of great. I really believe that that warrants some deep thinking, that we have good systems in the criminal justice system, and we know that. We have good practices, we have good policies, but being good is comfortable. And being good is the enemy of being great, because being great means we have to be uncomfortable and take risks. So as a change leader, we cannot settle for good. We have to settle for great. Also, we have to spend more time in the windshield and less time in the mirror. And the windshield in this case represents the future and the mirror represents the past. We have this cliche in the English language called hindsight is 2020. And that comes from, that whole Monday morning quarterback thing or armchair quarterbacking. We can look back in the past and have 20/20 vision over what we've done in the past. And if we look at that, oftentimes we really trust the past. We have lots of trust in what we've done in the past, but we don't trust the future because it's uncertain. And we don't have a cliche in the English language that says foresight is 20/20. We don't have a cliche that says we know with 100% certainty that this change is going to work. So a change leader has to take the idea that the future is certain and the past guides our future, but we don't have to do in the future what we've done in the past. So imagine this windshield mirror metaphor for a second. If you're driving your car and the windshield represents the future and your rear view mirror represents the past, what would happen if you're driving even to work today and you spend all of your time looking in the rear view mirror or the side mirrors and you're not looking in the windshield? It's not going to go too good for you. So as a change leader, we have to look in the windshield, which is much bigger than the rear view mirror. And that future is the windshield. And we have to be relentlessly committed to optimism, relentlessly committed to the future, relentlessly committed to getting through the problems of real world change. That is trusting the vision. So as a change leader, you're the North Star for others to follow. And that's not just what you do, but it's how you think. It's how you react to stress. It's how you confront situations in the real world when we get into that cocoon and things start changing and we start experiencing the pains of stress. And as a change leader, you have to trust in others to carry out that vision. People like to give leaders credit for change all the time. Anybody who's led successful change knows that the real change comes from the people doing the work. So as a change leader, your attitudes are contagious. You are the North Star for people to follow, and you have to trust others to carry out that work. And you trust them by knowing that your attitudes are contagious. Because principle number 2, Murphy hates us, comes into play. In the real world, stuff goes wrong. Murphy's law is that what can go wrong will go wrong, and that's 100% true in real world implementation work. Sometimes things go from bad to worse pretty quickly. I've seen it so many times where we start getting change initially. If you can imagine a curve, change starts happening real good at the beginning of a project or good at an implementation project, and then over time it starts eroding back to status quo. In a way, the organization relapses. You see it in our clients all the time. They start working towards change, they start getting results, and then it erodes back to status quo. And organizations are no different. If everything's going right, you might not be paying attention to what's really going on. If you really think that change is going well a couple years into the process, you might not be paying attention to what's really happening. And that's normal. Problems happen. And so we basically have to kind of take Murphy and say, Murphy, come on into our house, have a drink, stay for dinner, and know that there's going to be problems. And we have to predict that, and we have to plan for it. Without that, we know that change is going to erode back to status quo pretty quickly. So the idea with principle number 2 is that acknowledge the fact that implementation is messy and it's arduous, and we have to start planning to fail. Now that sounds dangerous in the criminal justice system. The word failure in the criminal justice system is kind of a scary concept. The idea is that our organizations are full of human processes, and we're working with humans, and we're collaborating with other organizations that are full of humans. And as humans, we're great at making mistakes. So strong implementation leaders, we will build failure into our implementation strategies and our timelines. The idea here is in the academy, for example, we actually give people who go through our academy some concrete tools on how to do this. You can imagine, say you apply for a grant, a federal grant or something like that, and you put this timeline in the grant that says, we're going to start the training on this date, and we're going to do coaching on this date, and then we're going to measure results on this date, and the grant will be done on this date. And you commit to this timeline at the beginning of the grant, and everybody knows, if you've ever had a federal grant or any kind of a grant, that that timeline gets all screwed up and it gets off course fairly quickly. And so as an implementation leader, when we plan those timelines and we plan our change strategies, at the beginning, we have to imagine what's going to go wrong. We have to start asking questions at the beginning of the change initiatives. What can go wrong? And then start planning for what we do when those things happen. In the academy, we give people some tools to do this, but the idea here is that if we start those conversations early on, when we experience those problems, our frustration levels will be less because we have planned for them, because we have predicted them, because we have documented what we might experience. And when we experience those things in the real world, that frustration level is much lower. Going back to the first principle of trusting the vision. These two are connected because we're going to say that when we get to those problems, number one, we predicted them because number two, Murphy hates you. And number two, we're going to get to those situations with relentless optimism, which is principle number 1, trusting the vision. So planning for failure is all about lessening the frustration when you get to those situations. So what I'm telling you is that at the beginning of your change initiative, or no matter where you're at in the change initiative, start having some meetings and conversations around what can go wrong with each of these strategies and each of these steps. What's going to go wrong in training? What's going to go wrong in training for trainers? What's going to go wrong in coaching? What's going to go wrong with fidelity? What's going to go wrong when we start having a legislative change and something else takes our attention? Principle number 3, be comfortable being uncomfortable. Go back to the metaphor of the butterfly in the cocoon for a second. You think that cocoon, it's comfortable inside that cocoon? Heck no. The comfort zone is a dangerous place for us to be as an implementation leader. We have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. A lot of people talk about change curves, and there are good change curves that we can look at. There are some ones that I don't think are real in the criminal justice system with implementation of evidence-based practice, and I'll explain that later in the webinar. But one of these change curves, for example, is known as the Kubler-Ross change curve, which gives us this illusion that there's 5 steps towards organizational change. And you can see those on the screen. And it gives us this idea that change starts off really optimistic at the beginning and we start feeling good, and then things get bad for a while, and then everything gets better over time. And it gives us this illusion that there's these really neat steps to change and that it's always just going to get better and over time, and just kind of hold on. And the Kubler-Ross change curve, in my opinion, isn't real world. Cotter has this 8-step model, and this is from the kind of mid-1990s, that basically says that change is 8 steps and that things get better and better over time, incrementally better, and it's very linear. You can look at like stages 7, 8, for example, that just says, don't let up and make it stick. What exactly do you do in those situations? I don't believe that real world change follows a linear process like this. One of the most popular models is Lewin's change model, which basically says that organizational change comes down to 3 basic steps: unfreeze, change, and refreeze. And the idea here is that the unfreeze stage, you just kind of open things up for a while. Change means you just do the change and then it's over. and then refreeze means you stop changing. I don't know about you, but I can imagine situations in the real world of the criminal justice system when we're unfreezing on something and changing on something totally different, refreezing on something totally different. Then we have to go back and unfreeze on something new, and then we have to change something that we messed up in the past. And so at any time in an organization, we're in these stages on different innovations and different implementations at any one time. So I don't think that change really goes in these neat linear ways. Uh, it reminds me a little bit of, sometimes that we see in like weight loss commercials or things like that. We see these great results, and it's kind of pitched out there to sell us on, using these products. But these organizations have figured out that there's a disclaimer that says these experiences are abnormal. These are not typical. These results are truly extraordinary. Extraordinary means outside of the ordinary. So I do not think that these linear change curves are I think they're extraordinary. I want to talk about the change curve that happens in the real world with the criminal justice system and in offender serving systems in general. The idea is that we have to find comfort in chaos. And if you look at the image, you'll see this person doing a very uncomfortable pose very intentionally. She even dressed special for the occasion. She maybe even planned it in her schedule. She probably even has a special room that she goes to be uncomfortable, because she knows that change is uncomfortable. She chooses this position intentionally, and it's somewhat chaotic. As change leaders and as implementation leaders, we have to be comfortable in situations of chaos. We have to basically do what she's doing here. So at an individual level, we know that change in 4 stages at the individual level, change comes in 4 stages. Imagine yourself learning a new skill, and it could be, playing a musical instrument, or learning a new skill, or learning a new evidence-based practice. It kind of all works the same. We start out unconsciously incompetent, and that's the box to the left that you see, which basically means we're ignorant. We don't know that we're not very good at something when we start out. And there's that saying that ignorance is bliss, which basically means we're happy in unconscious incompetence. We're happy not knowing that we're not good at something. We're totally cool with that. And as soon as we start learning a new evidence-based practice or a new thing, we go right away to conscious incompetence, which means we're consciously aware that we're not very good at doing something. And the feelings that come with that are stressful. They hurt. Imagine even starting to play a new instrument for the first time, or learning a new skill, or doing something new in your personal life or at work. And you start the new thing right away, and you find out that you're not very good at it. You might start thinking, I can't do this, I'm not made for this doesn't fit my skill set, or whatever it takes. And we start experiencing those negative feelings. And that's a natural place to be. We now know that we don't know how to do something. That's when people get out of the cocoon. When they get to conscious incompetence is when they start wanting to leave the cocoon of change, because it's uncomfortable. As a change leader, we have to go through this stressful and awkward learning stage, which you can kind of see in the green box up here, to get us to conscious competence, which means we're consciously aware that we're good at something. And in those situations, the feelings get better, because even though we have to work at it, and even though we have to apply ourselves a little bit harder, we're consciously aware that we start to get good at something. And it's not until we get to the latter stages of change, unconscious competence, where it becomes automatic. It becomes the new organizational habit. So whatever your evidence-based practices that you're working on right now might be the exception. In the future, it becomes the rule. It's not until the evidence-based practice becomes the rule rather than the exception that we're in unconscious competence. It's when it's automated. It's a new organizational habit. It's a new personal habit. It's integrated into attitudinally and in our practices the norm. So we go through these stages at an individual level, and between 2 and 3 is why we have a 70% failure rate with most change initiatives, because change is very uncomfortable and because change is very hard. Curve that I do like and that I do think relates to the real world, especially in the criminal justice system, is known as the productive zone of disequilibrium. So it'll take a second for your brains to kind of get wrapped around this, and I'll kind of walk this through you carefully. This axis right here, you can kind of look at the pointer on the screen. If you're low on this axis, it kind of means comfort. As you go up high on this axis, it's chaos or stress. The axis left to right is time. So that gives us kind of three zones. Zone down here is, you can look at it as the comfort zone. The middle zone is known as the productive zone of disequilibrium. The top zone is the chaos zone. So the idea here is if you just follow the curve, when we start changing, we're in our comfort zone, and then we get to this productive zone of disequilibrium. This is where we start changing, and change is healthy. But note that we're not comfortable. Comfort is down here in zone number 1. Change starts happening right here outside of our comfort zone. Now eventually, we might get to this chaos zone, which is above the productive zone of stress, and into the chaos zone. And we get to a point where it's too much. It might be too much change at once, or too difficult, or too hard. And the change leader's job is to help people get back into the productive zone of change. And over time, this curve goes up and down, up and down, up and down. It does not get better and better and better. It goes up and down constantly. And the leader's job is to navigate people through this productive zone of change. That's when we start changing organizationally, and that's when we start tipping the scales on that 70% failure rate. But know that this is not the comfort zone. The comfort zone is down here. What happens with people when they get to the stress zone, if you kind of look at the screen and look at the red pointer, when people get to their perceived limit of tolerance, they start copping out with these kind of technical challenges, or even just work avoidance that sometimes they'll just tap out. A technical challenge is kind of a cop out that happens of saying, well, we don't have the resources to do this, so we're just going to stop. Or we don't have the money to do this, so we're just going to stop. Or it's not my job description, or it's just going to stop. You know, something like that. For example, I was working in a site one time in Colorado with doing contingency management or incentives for offenders, and some people had thought they'd got to this zone and said, well, we can't do incentives for offenders because we don't have money to pay for all these incentives. And I said, okay, well, here's some money. I gave them quite a bit of money to pay for the incentives. The idea was they were using money to get out of the change. And when I gave them money to get to the change, they still had problems with change because it ultimately was not about money. It was about their stress. So that's a technical cop-out saying, we don't want to change, and our excuse is we don't have money. When I answered the money question, they still did not want to change because it was really about philosophy and about beliefs and about attitudes and ultimately about culture. And that's a technical challenge that they use to get back to their comfort zone. I was working with a site one time, and I was explaining this to them, and the change leader said, oh, I get this. I can see it like streetlights, where the comfort zone's like the green zone. That's the happy zone. That's where you want to be. So that's like a green street light. And the change zone is like yellow, like caution, things are getting a little bit rough. And then the chaos zone's the red light, like, oh crap, we got to pump the brakes. I thought about that for a second, and I told her, I can see that. I can see why you're thinking of that. You know, the comfort zone is green and the productive zone is yellow and the chaos zone is red. But if we're going to use the street lights as a metaphor, I want to see it differently. And this is how we need to see it as implementation leaders. The change zone is the green zone. That's where we pump the gas. And that change zone is not comfortable. The comfort zone is a problem. The chaos zone is where we kind of yield and where we pump the brakes. Maybe we downshift a little bit. That's when things are going a little bit rough, and we might slow down a little bit. We might downshift a little bit to get back to the green zone, which is the change zone. The danger zone is the comfort zone because we're not changing in our comfort zone. So if we're going to use the streetlights as a metaphor for change, we need to think of our comfort zone as the place we do not want to be. We need to think of the stress zone as the place where we do want to be, and the chaos zone as a zone where we want to pump the brakes. Because change curves are going to go up and down over time, and they're going to hit this chaos zone, and the change leader's job is to navigate back down to the productive zone, but never to the comfort zone. So our job as change leaders is to keep people uncomfortable and to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Think about it this way. In the comfort zone, we're safe and we're under control. As human beings and as organizations, our comfort zone is where we control things and when we feel safe. And think about that from a criminal justice system. We want to be under control and we want to be safe. Think about that. Our comfort zone is about public safety and about control. Right outside our comfort zone is the fear zone. And when we get to the fear zone, go back to principle number 1 when we talked about uncertainty and fear, that's when we start questioning our confidence and we maybe even have excuses to manage the stress. And we started recruiting the opinions of other people and saying, I don't know, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel, this new thing, this new evidence-based practice that we're doing clashes with our normal habits. That's not the change zone, that's the fear zone. And when we get into the fear zone, the change leader's job is to navigate people through the fear zone into the learning zone. And in the learning zone is where we start confronting those challenges and problems. That's when we start acquiring new skills and so we start stretching the limits of our comfort zone. That's where we start changing. And eventually, after the learning zone, we get to the growth zone. When we get to the growth zone is when we really start integrating evidence-based practices with other evidence-based practices, when it starts becoming the organizational habit, when it starts becoming the norm rather than the exception. That's when we start getting to real growth. Implementation leadership is about navigating people into the growth zone, through the learning zone, through the fear zone, and out of the comfort zone. Status quo is when we stay committed to our comfort zone. Think about that for a second. There is no comfort in the growth zone and no growth in the comfort zone. We have to be out of our comfort zone. So the idea is that to be successful, we have to improve. To improve, we have to learn. And to learn, we have to fail. In the criminal justice system, we don't like the word failure at all. So when we get to crisis situations, I really believe that in every crisis I've ever had with implementation and in general with the criminal justice system in particular, there's danger. When we get to crisis situations, there's danger. And as a change leader, we also have to look for opportunities because I have found that there are as many opportunities in crisis situations as there are dangers. But again, we're only going to react to those negative experiences that I talked about earlier, and we're gonna focus on those. But as a change leader, when we commit to relentless optimism, we have to commit to finding the opportunity when we have crisis situations. That is an attitude that people will follow. The idea in principle number 4 is that we have to adapt or die. Adapt or die. What we have in implementation real world is we have lots of symptoms and we have lots of problems. And a lot of times symptoms are cleverly disguised as problems. For example, you might have a symptom that people aren't showing up to coaching or training, or people aren't signing up for trainer for trainers, or fidelity measures aren't really working the way that you thought. And you have to ask yourself, is that a problem to deal with, or is that a symptom? Let's just use an example. Let's say that we've been working on the implementation of this evidence-based practice for 6 months. We've done a bunch of training and the energy is really good at the beginning. People stop showing up to training or coaching or something like that over time. And we start to see buy-in erode or participation erode, or we start to feel that practices are eroding back to status quo. We have to ask ourselves a real basic question. Is that a problem to deal with, or if it's a symptom? If it's a problem, we can navigate that problem with a directive. We can say, all right, well, you're not showing up to coaching or training. We're going to make you show up and we're going to put it in your performance plan, or we're going to hold you accountable or something like that. If we see it as a symptom, we're going to act a little bit differently in that situation. In our world of implementation of evidence-based practice, there are technical problems and there are adaptive problems. Technical problems are usually easy to identify. They're kind of black and white. They can usually solve by act of authority, and we can usually implement solutions pretty quickly. And they usually live in just 1 or 2 places of the organization. So you can think of a technical problem as, going back to the example I used earlier of money. Say that the organization really wants to use incentives, but it can't because there's no money to purchase incentives, or there's maybe a policy that doesn't allow you to buy certain things for incentives for your population. The way that we can solve that technical problem is we give money and we change a policy. Makes sense. That's a technical problem. If the organization wants to do incentives and the only thing in the way is a policy and money, we solve that technical problem with money and a policy. Now, adaptive problems are more difficult to identify. They're easy to deny, and those are usually attached to beliefs, attitudes, and culture. A lot of times, solutions in the adaptive space require experimentation, trial and error, throwing stuff against a wall and see if it sticks. And a lot of times, adaptive problems live in many places of the organization, all levels, all sites, all offices, in policy and procedure, in habits and practices. They live in the water cooler talk. If we have an adaptive problem that is about attitudes and culture and belief of the organization, we cannot solve that problem with a new policy and money. If we throw money or a policy at attitudinal problems, we will create more attitudinal problems, because what we've done is we've applied a technical solution to an adaptive problem. Remember, adaptive problems are complex, and they're about attitudes and beliefs. And if we try to govern those beliefs with policy, we might run the risk, we will run the risk of increasing negative attitudes about the change. We have to apply adaptive solutions to adaptive problems and technical solutions to technical problems. In the academy, we have some tools that we give people. I don't have time to go into that today for obvious reasons, but we have some tools about how to identify and diagnose a technical versus an adaptive problem. But for now, you can just imagine that technical problems are fairly black and white. Solutions are quick, and they usually live in one place in an organization that a leader can just quickly solve. Adaptive problems are much more complex, and I would say that in the world of implementation of evidence-based practice, we have far more adaptive problems than we do technical ones. And we make mistakes as change leaders solving adaptive problems with technical solutions. The idea is, when we do that, we often create more adaptive problems. I was working with a site one time, and I won't mention which state or which site, but the parole system was, the idea was that a new change leader came in and realized that the culture was really about law enforcement control and things like that. And the change leader came in and said, all right, we're going to change the culture of parole. And this parole agency were wearing essentially law enforcement outfits. And the change leader came in and said, all right, we're going to change your outfits without any collaboration, without any talk. He just came in very quickly and said, we're going to change the culture of this organization. We're going to take away your badge and take away your BDUs and take away your uniforms. And we're just going to have you dress in khaki pants and a polo shirt, and you're not going to get any input on that. But to solve that problem, we're going to pay for it so that you don't have any problems. You can imagine that without the collaboration, without the talk, that really upset a lot of people. It didn't change the culture. All it did was facilitate more negative beliefs and negative attitudes, because the people were not included in the change initiative. They were not even asked for their opinions about that. And ultimately, changing the uniforms of people doesn't necessarily change the culture of the organization. That was a technical solution applied to adaptive problem. So when we get into these situations, we're going to have a symptom or a problem, and we have to first ask ourselves that question. Say again, going back to the example, people are disengaging from training or coaching. We have to ask first, number one, is this a symptom or a problem? And if we believe it's a problem, we then have to ask, is it technical or adaptive? If it's a technical problem, we give a technical solution. If it's an adaptive problem, we apply an adaptive solution. If we believe, however, that it's a symptom, we have to keep asking then, what's it a symptom of? If we find out that it's a symptom of another symptom, we have to keep kind of digging down until we get to the root problem. And it's not until we get to the root problem that we can then go in to say, once we get to the root problem, then we diagnose it and say, is it technical or adaptive? If it's technical, we apply a technical solution. If it's adaptive, we apply an adaptive solution. So as a change leader, we have to adapt, but we also have to then diagnose the challenge. Before we apply a solution, we have to stop, we have to think, we have to talk to other people and say, is this a symptom or is this a problem? When we get to a problem, we ask the question, is it technical or adaptive? And based on the answer to that question, we apply the right solution. Principle number 5 is fail forward and fail often. The word failure is not friendly in the criminal justice system. We often don't like that word. And I'm making the case today that we need to fail often and always fail forward. The idea is that if we want to increase our successes with change, we have to double our failure rates. We have to intentionally fail. Sounds kind of strange, but that's true when we get into real world change and adaptive problems. We have to learn to experiment. If you think about, for example, a baby when it's learning to walk, as human beings, when we're learning to walk and we fall, what do our parents do? They keep encouraging us, right? They don't punish us when we fall or anything like that. They encourage us, and we know that babies are going to go through lots of failures before they learn to walk. For some reason, as adults, when we start having micro failures in our jobs or micro failures in leadership or micro failures in change, we somehow don't let ourselves have the ability to kind of forgive ourselves and fail forward. We got to remember that change is messy and change is arduous and it's full of unpredictable situations. And so as change leaders, we have to embrace trial and error. We have to try things. And we're conditioned to believe that perfectionism is like a virtue. You can imagine, say you're doing interviews for a job, you're filling a trainer position or a PO position or something like that. And you say, all right, what's your biggest strength and what's your biggest weakness? And they say, well, here's all my strengths. And then when they say weaknesses, what do they say? They say, well, I work too hard and I'm a perfectionist and, I try to do everything right all the time. And, I'm just a perfectionist. And underneath that is this idea that perfectionism is really a virtue. I think perfectionism is not a virtue. It's a vice in implementation of evidence-based practice, because perfectionism gives the idea that we're not going to move forward until we have the perfect solution. And we get stalled by perfectionist thinking. We get stumped with perfectionist thinking. We're going to confront situations that are adaptive in nature where there's no clear solution that is guaranteed to work. And when we get into those situations, we keep analyzing and keep analyzing and keep analyzing until we find the perfect solution and we start stalling. And when we stall is when we have to throw perfectionism out the window and we say, we are going to choose this solution and we are going to fail. And we're going to learn from that failure. Failure always precedes learning. So when we fear failure, we fear learning. We have to choose to fail forward, and we have to choose to fail often. And we have to build failure into our implementation strategies. We have to go from success. Success is essentially going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. Think back to principle number 1, trusting the vision. We start, we're going to confront a situation, we're going to go from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm, which means we go from problem to problem without loss of enthusiasm. Remember, your attitudes are contagious as a change leader. So the idea is that those organizations that have successfully implemented evidence-based practice know that they go from problem to problem and failure to failure with increases in enthusiasm, with relentless optimism and trusting the vision. And we have to know as change leaders that just because we experience failure does not mean we are failures. We have to separate the concept of being a failure from experiencing failure. Those are two very different things. Experiencing failure is a good thing. I think the wave at a professional sporting event is maybe the best example I can think of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. We've all been to a professional sporting event, NBA or NFL or hockey or anything really. And you think of a wave in the stadium. In Colorado, for example, we have our Denver Broncos Stadium, which is about 70,000 people. Who usually starts the wave for 70,000 people? It's usually 2 kids or 2 drunk dudes, and both of them, their inhibitions are down, right? So they start to wave, they stand up, they wave their hands, they have, number 1, they trust their vision. They have relentless optimism that they're going to get 70,000 people to do the wave with them. They stand up the first time, they wave their hands in the air, and they fail. They sit back down, they stand up again, they yell louder, they stay optimistic, they trust the vision, they know that things are going to go wrong. Principle number 2, Murphy hates us. They stand up again because they know things are going to go wrong. They choose to be comfortable being uncomfortable. They choose to fail forward and often. And they stand up again, failure number 2. They stand up a third time, 2 people turns to 10. They stand up again, 10 people turns to 20. They stand up again, 20 turns to 100. They stand up again. 100 turns to 2,000. They stand up again. 2,000 turns to 5,000. They sit down, they stand up again. 5,000 stays at 5,000. 5,000 goes back down to 3,000. It goes back down to 1,000. They keep standing up. Next thing it's 6,000, 10,000, 8,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 70,000. Eventually, after many, many failures, the entire stadium is doing the wave. And those two change leaders can stop, they can sit back down, and the wave goes on without them. Why is that? Because they've applied, number one, relentless optimism. They've trusted the vision. Number two, they know that things are going to go wrong. They know that Murphy's going to come into play. They know that they got to fail forward and fail often. They know that they're going to adapt their response and die. They have chosen to be uncomfortable in those situations. In the real world, change is not neat. And so as change leaders, we have to apply these principles as if we're doing the wave in the stadium. So in change situations, we have this concept of a plan, do, study, act cycle. Plan, do, study, act is a very known model where we kind of take these rapid improvements where we plan the change, we do the change, we study what went wrong, and then we act on what we learned, and then we keep planning, we do it all over again, we study what went wrong, we act on what we learned, we do another plan, we do it, so on and so forth. And the PDSA cycle is a well-known organizational tool to use rapid improvement cycles to implement new strategies. What's wrong about the PDSA cycle is that it implies failure. If you think about it, plan, do, it implies that there's going to be a failure in there so that we study that failure and act on what we learned. In my opinion, PDSA should be PDFSA, plan, do, fail, study, act. We have made failure a taboo. We have to put it on Front Street as change leaders and say we expect to fail because failure precedes learning. We have to take the attitude that it's about progress and not perfection. We have to take the attitude that because we experience failure, we are not failures. So even though the PDSA cycle is a very good organizational tool, it makes failure a taboo. And we have to put failure on Front Street in the criminal justice system and confront it because it's gonna happen. So what I'm saying is that we cannot fear failure. We have to become friends with failure, and we have to fail forward and fail often. If we want to increase our successes with change, we have to double our failures. Principle number 6, culture is king. This is where things start getting real. And I'm going to spend some extra time on this, knowing that there's a lot to learn here. There's an entire 2-day academy we have around culture change. So I'm just going to give you some kind of highlights, but I do want to go into some depths a little bit with organizational culture. What we've learned over time, and Peter Drucker saw this a long time ago, he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. One thing we have to learn in the criminal justice system is that culture is always upstream from strategy, and strategy is always upstream from our results. If you think of the word implementation, implementation is strategy. Your evidence-based practice is strategy. Culture is always upstream from that. And so when we're working with implementation and when we're working with evidence-based practice, we have to think that those are strategies and that culture is going to eat that strategy for breakfast if we neglect it. So what do I mean by culture? You know, if you're mathematically minded, you can say that there might be an equation. Organizational culture is if you take inputs plus mindset. So inputs is like people and habits and practices and policies and all the things we do in an organization that make up our organization. That's inputs. Mindset is essentially our beliefs and our attitudes and our habits and our values and kind of what we go to in terms of our core values and the why behind what we do in our work. We take the sum of that, our people and our practices plus our collective mindset, and we raise that to the power exponentially of dialogue and interaction. What are we talking about? What are we talking about in problem situations? What do we say at the water cooler? What do we talk about in meetings? What do we talk about when we're just kind of casually hanging out at work? That dialogue has an exponential effect on the culture of the organization. So culture is essentially, if you think about it from a very conceptual standpoint, it's kind of whatever happens, what somebody has to know to fit in. Culture is not really material. It does not consist of just things and people and behavior and feelings. It consists of those, but it's about how those are organized in an organization. It's the way that those things are set up proportionally and the way that they're organized and how people relate to them and how people interpret them. That's what forms culture. It's very immaterial and it's hard to kind of quantify it. It's hard to measure, but we can measure it, but it's hard without actually doing some measurement tools. Culture will always win. Because it's immaterial, we sometimes neglect it. And when we neglect it, we will get to that 30% success rate or 70% failure rate that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. So I'm going to talk about the Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument, the ACJI, and the Competing Values Framework. This is a very well-known and well-tested organizational tool to help measure and identify organizational culture. So I'm going to give you the basics of this, knowing that we have to go through this fairly quickly, but I will give you some basics of the ACJI and the Competing Values Framework. Over time, what's been learned in a lot of the organizational research is that organizations, regardless of type, have 2 points of tension. Organizations are essentially in situations where they struggle, or they're 2 main points of tension between an internal focus, where we integrate abstract things and we converge and we organize abstract things and we kind of get them to quantify into something simple, and it's really internally focused, kind of focused on ourselves. Or organizations are externally focused, and it's about differentiating from status quo and diverging from status quo, or taking information and departing from that. And all organizations have tension between this internal focus and this external focus, this kind of convergent mindset or a divergent mindset. There's also a tension point between being flexible at the top and stable at the bottom, having discretion at the top or control at the bottom. And as organizations, we're always in points of tension between being flexible and using a lot of judgment and autonomy, or about being stable and about being in control. So if we put these 2 points of, if we put these 2 axes together, we have what's called the Competing Values Framework. So imagine an organization that is, if you watch the screen, internally focused and also flexible. Or maybe an organization over here that's stable, but also external. We're about control and also about diverging. Or maybe we're about being flexible and also being about externally focused. We start to get some typologies in these 4 quadrants that forms the Competing Values Framework. So organizations that are internally focused and about flexibility, we can kind of call that the collaborate culture. That culture is very family-like, and it's very focused on its own members, and it's very collaborative and says we're going to kind of include everybody in the decision, and we're going to be very collaborative in how we go about doing things. Another organization might be externally focused, kind of focused on customers or focused on the future, and also flexible, and that's a create culture. That's an innovation culture. That's where we experiment and innovate. You can imagine like Google or something like that. They're very focused on customers, focused on the external environment, very creative and very flexible. Google, for example, they get people all the time to try to break their own innovations, and they reward people with breaking their own innovations. That's a very externally focused and very flexible organization, culturally speaking. Some organizations are very internally focused and also about stability. Think about that for a second. Internally focused and focused on stability. Those are control cultures. Criminal justice systems, for example, law enforcement organizations are very much like that. Very focused on protecting ourselves, focused on protecting our processes, and focused about kind of having lots of predictable processes and a lot of control and avoiding risks. And other cultures are about competition. External organizations that are kind of focused on stability are kind of more competitive, kind of more market-based, if you will. They're going to really be about stretching targets and stretching goals and things like that. So in this framework, we have different types of cultures, and the idea is that our organization has attributes of all these aspects to it, but we have 1 or 2 maybe dominant typologies to our culture. And the OCAI helps us to measure where we're at in these 4 domains. So for example, the creative profile, or the yellow, those are kind of ad hoc, they might be temporary even. They're very innovative and transformation minded, and very idea minded and creative. And they're focused on the future and held together by a vision. They love to experiment, and they really welcome diverse ideas and diverse thought. They really focus on agile. They don't worry so much about speed. They focus a lot more on agility, and they take a lot of dynamic approaches, and they really like kind of departing from the norm, and they're very inspired by ideas. They have this attitude that the best way to kill an idea is to develop a policy. Think about that in the criminal justice system. A lot of times we solve we solve problems with policies. In the create culture, they don't like to get to a policy right away. They like to experiment. They like to throw things against a wall. The create culture is really dynamic, and it's very idea-minded and really focused on the future. That's really a good change culture, because it really is experimental and really invites risks and really invites agility. Now, the control culture, which is kind of the opposite quadrant, the green, that's really held together by very capable processes and very capable logistics. Organizations that are in the control profile or hierarchy, they really have a lot of control decision making, where 1 or 2 people call the shots. They're where members really conform to the policies, and where risks are not taken, and that we depart from the norm is actually a sign of risk. And the idea with the control culture is we really welcome predictable situations and really rigorously tested methods, and we like consistency and uniformity in the way that we do our business, and we change only incrementally, and we really try not to tolerate errors, really significant errors. We kind of think in the control culture there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things, and we always focus on doing the right way to do it, and we don't focus on doing the wrong way. Now, in the opposite culture, which is the yellow or the create culture, they take the idea of, we're going to try things the wrong way and see how it works. The green culture or the control culture says, we don't like to do the wrong way, we like to do the right way. We all have attributes to that in our culture. McDonald's, for example, and Ford, they're good examples of aspects of control culture. When you go to McDonald's, regardless of where you go in the United States, the products always look the same, they taste the same, they're branded the same, they're identical. And the good thing about a hierarchical culture is that they're very predictable process. They have a lot of control over what they do, and they train people that really are about conforming to the way that the food is prepared and the types of products they buy and things like that. Their food preparation is highly standardized, and to get promoted, you have to go through a very long manual to know what all those processes are, and you have to really know all the processes of the organization. And so the good thing about hierarchical cultures or control cultures is that you get really predictable results, and you get really highly reliable results. And Ford company historically has had an aspect to it, because they have really strong quality control, and they have long-standing models that stand the test of time. And so sometimes hierarchy cultures or control cultures get a bad rap, but as you can see, there are many successful businesses that have control aspects to their culture. The idea is that there isn't necessarily a good or bad culture, there's just the right culture for what you're trying to do. Now, the compete culture, so that's externally focused and stable, that's the kind of culture that's really focused on market share, and they're really about speed and short-term wins. They kind of take an athletic approach to their work. They're about stretching really ambitious goals and targets, and really quick to get solutions, and they focus on like penetrating market share, or members are really just the producers. They're just about getting the results, and they incentivize members to get results, and they kind of focus on the bottom line, and they got really driving leadership and hardworking people, and really start stretching those targets. They take the attitude that it's better to aim high and miss the mark than aim low and hit it. And market cultures are really about getting results and getting there quickly and really capitalizing on aggressive goals. Now, the opposite side of that is the collaborate culture. They're a little bit slower to change, but because they're community minded, they're very egalitarian, where they like to collaborate, and they like to involve a lot of members in decision making. And decision making is very decentralized, and there's a sense of we, and there's a sense of partnership. The organization is really not as much an economic entity, it's more about an extended family, and it's that organization is held together by human growth and human development and professional development and cohesion and morale and human values and consensus and cooperation and mentorship and team building, and all the things that make people feel really good about being in a collaborate culture is that you really care about me. That's an internal focused, and you're so flexible that you're willing to kind of design your organization around my needs as a member. Flexible, internally focused, and flexible. That really focuses on the collaborate culture, and they really feel like a handshake is more important than a contract. Contracts are for market cultures and hierarchy cultures or green cultures. Handshakes are about a human connection. They're about a human agreement, and handshakes are part of that collaborate culture. So the idea is that the clan culture, as you can see here in the red, competes with the market culture, and the adhocracy culture, that creative yellow experimental culture, competes with the hierarchy culture. So organizations are in these competitions between red and blue and yellow and green, or adhocracy and hierarchy and clan and market. And so we're always kind of stressed about where we're going to be. And if we measure organizational culture, we'll get a profile of how we are on each of those four domains, knowing that we have aspects to all four in our culture. If you can kind of see it like clan culture, the family culture versus adhocracy, hierarchy, and market, these cultures really drive our implementation work. And over time, we have found that culture really matters with implementation work, to the point of measuring it. There's a study done here in Colorado and several organizations where we assessed them with the Organizational Culture Assessment Inventory, and we also assessed them with a tool that measures some implementation science domains known as drivers. And the idea with these drivers is essentially they're the key ingredients of implementation science, that when you follow these key ingredients or these drivers, you're more following implementation science strategies. And when we put those together, we kind of cross-referenced the drivers, which you see here in the non-highlighted cells. I'm kind of using the red pointer to look at the drivers. We won't go into these in detail, against the different cultural typologies. And we looked at the relationship between which cultures perform best on which of the implementation drivers. And anything that you see with the star next to it, those are essentially cells that mean they're statistically significantly related. Anything that's shaded kind of gray or blue is significantly and statistically related in a positive way. And anything you see in purple is statistically significantly related in a negative way. The idea is, if you can see that clan and adhocracy cultures are very statistically significantly positively correlated with organizational change or with good implementation science. Market cultures, no significant relationship, but hierarchy cultures are statistically significantly negatively related to implementation science. Think about that for a second. Hierarchy cultures that are controlling, process-oriented, highly structured, centralized decision-making do not perform well with implementation science tools. That means criminal justice systems, which have a lot of hierarchical components to our cultures, have to rethink our culture. This is why we have a 70% failure rate in organizational change. This is why we have a 14% success rate in implementation science, or a 10%, or 8%. Because a lot of government systems have hierarchy components to it that serve a purpose for public safety and predictable results and things like that, but they are also not hospitable to change. That means we have to look at our culture in the criminal justice system, in government systems, in offender serving systems, in order to look at implementation. Culture is always upstream from strategy. Culture eats implementation science for breakfast. Culture eats evidence-based practice for breakfast. If we neglect culture, we're going to be one of the failures. We have a whole model at ACJI that's about 2 days worth of work to identify culture and diagnose culture and look at some different alternatives to changing culture, and we give people some tools to identify culture and to change culture. And it's far too much to go into today. But the idea is that we have a model that we use to help you with specific tools and training and education on how to change culture. And we actually give you the tools and go deeper into the principles of implementation leadership. Equal number 7 is leading hearts and minds, which means when we're leading change, we have to not just lead the brains of the people, we have to lead their hearts. Because remember, go back to the beginning, that we experience problems, that we like negative feelings, and we have to really apply ourselves to leading people's why behind what they do, and leading their purpose, and leading their sense of purpose in the organization. It's not just enough for us to lead the logistics. It's not enough for us to just lead people's behavior. We have to lead their brain, and we have to lead their heart. And as implementation leaders, sometimes we neglect one or the other. The idea is that when you inspire others' mindset, we get to spend less time governing their behaviors. As leaders, one of the worst things that we generally don't like having to govern people's behaviors, but we spend a lot of time doing that. And as implementation leaders, we have to focus on the mindset of the people that we lead. Because if we can influence people's minds and their hearts, we spend less time governing behaviors. That's a very important part of leadership, is not just leading the tasks, but leading the mindset. Leading change is about leading the mindset. The idea is that when we ask people to change, we're going to be asking them to withdraw from this kind of interpersonal savings account. We're taking out some interpersonal capital from when we're asking people to change. We're asking people to work outside their comfort zone. We're asking people to fail. We're asking people to adapt or die. We're asking people to know that things are going to go wrong. So we're going to be withdrawing from our interpersonal bank account with that person. That means we have to make deposits, which means we have to really build that interpersonal savings account up. We have to know that, when it comes down to it, change is exhausting when done to us, but it's exhilarating when done by us. And think about that for a second. Change is exhilarating when done by us and exhausting when done to us. When you are being changed, you're stressed. When you are leading change, you kind of feel good. When you're inspiring change, you kind of think you're doing the right thing, and it's an exhilarating idea. But when you're asking other people to change, it's an exhausting experience. And so we really have to really focus on trust. And that means that when people are complying with the tasks, that does not necessarily mean they're adhering to our vision. It just means they may be temporarily complying with the tasks because we told them to do that, and it's their jobs. We have to focus on what's behind compliance, what's behind their behaviors, and get to their heart and their mind. We have to get to their heart and their mind so that they adhere to the vision, adhere to the vision, adhere to what we're trying to do. That means we have to trust in them and spend our time building up our interpersonal capital with those people. This word collaboration comes to mind. We think, well, how do we do this? How do we lead the hearts and the minds? And we might say, well, we collaborate. We invite them to make decisions. We have committees and implementation teams, and we do this collaboration stuff. And that's okay. Collaboration is good, not great. And remember, as implementation leaders, good is the enemy of great. Collaboration is good. It is not great. What's great is co-elevation. Co-elevation essentially means that when we're collaborating and when we're together and when we're talking one-on-one with our followers, or when we're talking to other leaders, our job is to not collaborate with them. That just means we work together, right? Collaborate means means together, labor means work, ate means it's a verb. Co-labor, ate, it just means we work together. It doesn't really mean much other than we work together. Co-elevation means we make each other better. So we're coaching each other. We're building each other up. We're giving each other constructive feedback. We're committed to relentless optimism. Co-elevation means when we're working together, we come out of that experience better than when we started. So we have to co-elevate. Simon Sinek has a great video, and I would really encourage you guys to watch it online. You can go on YouTube and just do a YouTube search on Simon Sinek, and he does this thing about focusing on the why. It's about a 20-minute video. It's a great video, and it basically says that We have to focus as change leaders, we have to focus on the why before we focus on how people do what they do and what they have to do. People will not buy into the hows and the whats, which are the tasks of implementation, the tasks of evidence-based practice. People will not buy into that long term unless they understand why. So as change leaders, we have to focus on the why of change. We have to continue to put emphasis on the why behind the change. This is what I've seen happen, and I've done it myself probably far too many times than I'd ever like to admit. We start a change initiative and we say, all right, we're going to collaborate and we're going to get all this buy-in. So we have these events where we say, all right, we're going to get buy-in, and we sell the evidence-based practice, and we do this kind of event, and we say, okay, we got everybody's buy-in, we check the box, we got the buy-in, so now we're going to start focusing on the how and the what. And we focus on the why as if it were an event, and then we start focusing on the how and the what, which are the tasks, the strategies like training and coaching and things like that. We have this illusion that buy-in is an event, that once we get it, we're good to go. Buy-in is not an event. Buy-in is a process. As implementation leaders, we have to know that we continually focus on the why, not just the hows and the whats. Buy-in does not happen permanently. Buy-in is temporary. Buy-in is only good until people get out of the comfort zone. And once people start getting out of their comfort zone and into the change zone, that buy-in goes away because they're stressed. So as change leaders, we have to focus on the why throughout the implementation work. We have to focus on the why all the time, not as an event, but as a process. We know that what causes people to engage in their jobs and engage in organizational change comes down to co-elevation, which is making each other better, autonomy, giving people power in making decisions, letting people experiment, letting people have trial and error, letting people fail. Mastery means giving them the skills, going beyond training, going beyond coaching, getting into skill practice and skill rehearsal, and communities of practice and fidelity measurement, coaching people one-on-one and coaching people in groups and really getting mastery over their jobs, but also giving them a sense of purpose, which means focusing on the why and keeping people engaged about the purpose of why they work in the criminal justice system, or why they work with substance abusing clients, or why they work with duly diagnosed clients, and continuing to focus on that why behind the work. People get engaged if they co-elevate, if they feel like that they're getting made better, if they're given autonomy, if they're given mastery, and if they're given purpose. And as change leaders, we have to focus on all four of those attributes when we're leading change. Principle number 8 gets to being intentionally infinite. Those sound like a strange word at first, and I'll tell you what they mean. But essentially what it means is, in change situations and in implementation leadership situations, when we're implementing evidence-based practice, we have to play the infinite game. We have to take the idea that change is perpetual. Change is not temporary. And you all know, if you're in a chief position or a captain position, or you're working with a legislator or even city council or county commissioners or government systems or the governor's office, we're at the beginning of a change cycle in the criminal justice system. I think we're at the beginning of a long era of change. And we have to learn to be agile, that change is going to be, and it is, always our rule and not the exception. We have to reimagine change as not the thing that's different, but the thing that's normal. And that means we have to take an infinite approach to our change, and we have to be very intentionally focused on the infinite game. And what does the infinite game mean? I'll tell you about that in a few minutes, but it's kind of about, sometimes we get focused on the things that are urgent and not the things that are important. We have a crisis and we respond to the crisis and we neglect the thing that's really important. And what's important is implementing evidence-based practice. And sometimes the urgent things get us take up all of our time in change situations. Sometimes when we're focusing on the thing that's urgent, that's finite thinking a lot, because it's kind of like, I got to check this thing off my list. This urgent situation comes in, I got to just get this done. Those are finite types of tasks. What's important is infinite. And that means our mindset has to be really focused on infinitely changing and knowing that change is always going to be going on. And it's not the exception, it's the rule. Now, the idea is that, it's often said that implementing evidence-based practice, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, so it's playing the long game, and it's not about getting to the change right away. And I appreciate that. Um, and if we think about marathon or a sprint, it's really important in the world of implementation of evidence-based practices to focus on agility and not speed. Speed is the sprint. Agility is something altogether different. If you look at the video, for example, you can see this guy. He's kind of running a hurdle race here. It's a sprint, and he's winning, but he's not focusing on agility. He's focusing on speed, and you could see what's happening. He's winning, but he's not going to win. He's running faster than everybody else, but he's not going to win that sprint, right? Marathons are about playing the long game. Marathons are about kind of not focusing on speed and focusing on something different. Now, this person here, this is Barry Sanders, if you know anything about football, look at his agility. He's running sideways. He's running backwards. This is the way implementation works. This is the real world. This is not the Kubler-Ross change curve. This is not the unfreeze, change, refreeze. This is not Cotter's 9-step model of change. He's not running forward. He's running sideways. He's running backward, but he's getting yardage. He's probably running, 200 or 300 yards to score a 100-yard touchdown. That is agility. That is implementation. That is what we're talking about in our mindset around leading change. But really, I don't think that implementation is either a marathon or a sprint, because those are finite games. And what I mean by that is a finite game means there's kind of fixed rules, there's a known playbook, there's a start and a stop. I mean, there's an identifiable time that you start and identifiable time that you stop. And both marathons and both sprints have all that. They have a start and a stop. They have rules, and they have, kind of the end is to win. The end is to have this finite designation as a winner or a loser, and it's kind of permanent. It's to kind of beat the opponent. Another way to think of a finite game is think of a board game, for example. You take Monopoly or something like that. A finite game is you open the board game, you follow the rules. It's got fixed players and fixed rules, and it's got a start and a stop, and the goal is to terminate the game. The goal is to close up the board game at the end and say there's a winner and there's a loser, and we're done. Organizational change and implementation does not work that way. Infinite game is a growth mindset. So essentially what it means is that the rules are changeable. It means the playbook is changeable. The players might be changeable. We can tolerate turnover in probation and parole and community supervision and prisons and jails and behavioral health agencies. We can tolerate turnover because the rules are going to change and the players are going to change. And there's not a start and a stop. There's not a time at which we stop changing. The infinite mindset is that we're always going to be changing, which means we're going to be changing our rules and changing our players and changing the plays and all those types of things. And the objective is not to terminate the game. The objective is to not terminate change. The objective is to perpetuate the game, which means perpetuate change, perpetuate innovation, perpetuate organizational development, perpetuate continual growth, perpetuate organizational learning, right? In that game, we don't believe there's a winner or a loser. We believe that we're only ahead or behind, which are temporary, right? If you imagine for a second, you're implementing an evidence-based practice. Don't think for a second, are we succeeding or are we failing? Think, are we ahead or behind? Those are temporary thoughts. Those are temporary designations. Ahead or behind can be dynamic. They can change. There's a time that we can be behind and we can get ahead. There's a time when we're ahead and we might fall behind. Think of that Barry Sanders video that I just showed you. There's times when he's ahead and times when he's behind and times when he's going to the left and times when he's going to the right, and he's neither ahead nor behind. That's the infinite game. So as change leaders, we have to take an infinite mindset that we're always going to be changing. There's always going to be different players. The plays are going to change. And our job is to perpetuate continual change, which means as change leaders, and please hear this, our job is not to stop changing. Our job is to teach other people's how to change. Teach our staff how to change. Teach our supervisors how to change. Perpetuate implementation leadership in our organizations, because when we get done with our jobs as change leaders, the generation behind us is going to have to know how to change. And we have to be able to purvey implementation leadership with them so that they know how to change. Finite leadership is kind of focused on arbitrary goals and timelines and technical approaches. You know, it's about temporary thinking. Infinite leadership is focused on the why. It's about continuing the game and grounding ourselves in purposes. And ultimately, it's about having flexible plays and agile players. Infinite leadership is implementation leadership. It's focusing on the perpetual game. Principle 9 is take the leap. And what this means in take the leap is we're going to get into situations where we confront problems. And if we go to the left, we're going to experience this problem. If we go to the right, we're going to have that problem. If we go forward, we're going to have that problem. If we go backwards, we're going to have that problem. At that point, we have to take the leap. When we've analyzed all the different scenarios of all the problems we have, and no matter where we go, we come up with a solution that's very imperfect, we have to just take the leap. What happens in implementation of evidence-based practice situations is we come across these situations where we get into analysis paralysis, where no matter which way we go, we're going to have a problem. And some people will get paralyzed by that. They will figure that we have to just analyze these problems until we find the perfect solution, and we're not going to move forward until we have the perfect solution. And sometimes change leaders neglect to just take the leap. And when we take the leap, it basically means that we're going to throw away fear and we're going to embrace courage. And all courage means is that we're scared, but we have a plan, that we have the gumption to trust. Courage is no different than fear, only in the sense that courageous leaders have the gumption to follow a trusted plan. And ask anybody who's been in courageous situations, and they will tell you they've been scared, but they have the willingness to have a trusted plan that they have the gumption to follow. And in change situations, when we take the leap, you know, we can make a choice and we can worry about the future, and everybody knows that worrying doesn't change the outcome, right? Everybody knows that you can worry all day long about what's going to happen tomorrow, or worry about the consequences of making a decision. You know, but I always like to say that worrying doesn't rob tomorrow of its problems. Worrying only robs today of its joy, right? Worrying doesn't change anything about tomorrow; it just robs today of its joy. If we think about worry, it's basically just a creative use of our imagination, right? Worrying is painting a picture in our brain of all the worst case scenarios. And instead of painting the picture of what we don't want, why don't we focus on the thing that we do want? You know, they say that, you know, fighting against something means you're focusing on the very thing that you don't want. And we're putting all of our heart and our mind into the thing that we don't want. If we fight for something, which is implementation, then we get to focus on the things that we do want, which means we can embrace that relentless optimism. We can embrace being outside of our comfort zone. We can embrace failure. We can embrace adaptive problems. We can embrace and confront our culture. We can take the leap. So when we get into situations when we're kind of screwed, no matter which way we go, we can worry or we can imagine. And when we imagine, we're taking on that kind of yellow change culture, that imaginative, ad hoc change culture of experimenting and looking for trial and error and throwing things against the wall and using imagination. As leaders, we have to look around the corners, right? We have to look around the corners of what's going on, and we have to know that perfection is the enemy, and we have to try to experiment. Finally, the last principle in implementation leadership is savoring the journey. Because change is an infinite game, because the criminal justice system and offender serving systems and human serving systems are at the beginning of a period of change, we have to savor the journey, and knowing that our job as implementation leaders is to know that human progress is difficult, change is challenging, it's wrought with frustration, and progress is even, you know, organizational progress is just as difficult. And so when we get in those situations and when we have trials and experiences, we're contributing to the greater knowledge of the world. We're contributing to teaching organizations and staff and people and future leaders how to change. You know, as change leaders, our job is not to create more followers. Our job is to create more leaders. And our job is not to create more leaders to keep things the same. Our job is to create more leaders to learn how to change. And so savor the journey means when we're ambitious, we get disappointed when things don't go right. And so we have these experiences where our level of ambition casts a shadow when we have problems, or our level of frustration. And we can't let our ambition overshadow our small wins. And we have to focus on the small wins. And we have to teach other people how to change and really know that at the end of the day, we're contributing to the greater knowledge of the criminal justice system. And people serving systems are just starting to learn how to change. And our job in this era is to teach other organizations how to change. An implementation leader helps us get the mindset that we need to change and implement evidence-based practices from the sense of addressing the real world. Change is not neat, it's not comfortable. That butterfly metaphor, you know, think of the cocoon again, it's not a pleasurable process. And as implementation leaders, we have to just embrace the truth. So the idea with Savor the Journey is that you scribble your failures in the sand and we carve our successes in stone. And what that means is when we have our failures, we scribble them in the sand. Scribble means careless. Sand means temporary, right? The sand doesn't hold a scribble very long. We document it. We focus on it for a second. We're kind of careless about it. At the end of the day, it goes away. As an implementation leader, we have to carve our successes in stone, which means we have to go to great lengths to focus on the small wins. Carving is harder work than scribbling. That means we have to be very intentional about focusing on the small wins, focusing on progress, not perfection. Be uncomfortable, and carve those permanently in stone and focus on our wins. That is really savoring the journey. So once again, the 10 principles combined is we trust the vision, right? We have relentless optimism. We know that our moods are contagious. Number 2, Murphy hates us. We know that things are going to go wrong. We plan for failure at the beginning of the process. We build failure in our implementation plans. Principle number 3, we agree that there is no comfort in the growth zone. There's no growth in the comfort zone. We're going to find comfort in chaos. And remember that disequilibrium or stress is not the exception, it's the rule. And we have to get beyond the fear zone, get beyond the comfort zone, and get to the change zone. Adapt or die means we diagnose symptoms versus problems. Once we get to problems, we discern, are those technical problems or adaptive problems? And then we remember that we apply technical solutions to technical problems and adaptive solutions to adaptive problems. We embrace failure, principle number 5. We know that perfection is a vice and failure is a virtue. We focus on progress, not perfection. We embrace trial and error, and we go from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. Principle number 6, we assess culture, we measure culture, we change culture, we pay attention to our culture, we learn how to do that. Number 7, we don't just focus on what you do to implement, we just don't focus on how you do it, we always focus on why you do it. Buy-in is not an event, it's a process. And complying with the rules is not adherence to the vision. As leaders, we focus on adherence to the vision. Adherence means I voluntarily adhere to the vision. Complying with the vision does not mean we adhere to it. Number 8, we take a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset. We play the infinite game. We know there are going to be changing rules and changing players, and that we don't focus on a winner or a loser. We focus on being ahead or behind, and that we focus on agility and not speed. Number 9, we take the leap. Means we guard against analysis paralysis. We know that courage is basically just fear with a trusted plan that we have the willingness to follow, and that we use imagination, not worry. When we're imagining the future, we don't worry about it, we imagine. And number 10, we know that the trials that we experience contribute to the greater knowledge of this world. And we don't let our ambition overshadow our small successes. And our job is to create better leaders, not better followers. These 10 principles I'm happy to share with you. If you send me an email to glenn@acji.org, I'm happy to share with you an infographic that's a kind of a one-page summary, or we call it shortcuts to these principles. Just know that as I've talked to you kind of conceptually about these 10 principles, we have a whole 3-day academy around this and another 2-day academy around culture change. And you can access that information on our website. But I'm happy to email this to you all. I'm happy to share this infographic with you that you can share abundantly in your organizations and give to people. And it has these 10 principles and some quick shortcuts to always remind us that these 10 principles are new vocabulary. And I promise you that if you start using this vocabulary in your organizational change efforts, it will be contagious. And I promise you that when people start taking the attitudes of be comfortable being uncomfortable and trusting the vision and failing forward and leading the hearts and playing the infinite game, that the mindset of your organization will change. And it will change enough to use implementation science to get to fidelity with your implementation practice. And it's all based on top of the idea that change is not a neat process. So I've enjoyed the time to spend with you. This is my contact information. We're going to terminate the webinar at this point, and I will go ahead and entertain questions from anybody. You can use the chat window or to send any questions you might have, and with the time that we have left, I'm happy to entertain any questions. That sounds good. So I got the question. I'll distribute the video and the materials once received. So Captain, I'll go ahead and email those. I'll email you the infographic actually immediately after we terminate the webinar. Once we get it kind of organized into a video, Allison can send you a link to go ahead and download that, and we will share that with you at your will. So I'm happy to do that for you. If anyone has any questions about any of the principles, I'm happy to address those, or any questions about the academy or any questions about culture. A lot of times questions about culture come up, or any of these principles. So a question came in, sending you information about the Academy. I will go ahead and include that in my email to you as well, Captain. I have a document that I'll share with you to just kind of talk about it from a practical perspective, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you, you know, next week or at another time to talk about the Academy. Essentially, it's about 2.5 days initially to learn the 10 principles, and we give you some tools and practice sessions, and we do a lot of group discussion and scenario work. And what our people have found over time is that in the Academy, learning from the other people about how to apply these principles and using the tools that we give people really increases people's confidence about how to kind of take these principles from abstract to more concrete. We also have another 2-day academy that's kind of a follow-up to that, which is the organizational change model that we have called Ideate. And we give you a specific tool on how to use the OCAI to measure your organizational culture. And we give you some specific tools and teach you how to use them on how to change culture towards the culture that you want. And it's kind of, the idea is to identify the culture that you want and learn how to change the culture towards your ideal culture. So I'm happy to send you that information. So a question came up, is there any correlation between reality-based television influencing negative behavior and increasing the difficulty of changing those behaviors? It's a fascinating question. I'd probably handle that question a little bit differently. You know, if you think of it generationally, for example, and I don't like to be a generationalist, but there is some science behind the concept of different generational thinking. And a lot of people ask me, the millennial culture is we're in a culture of technology and rapid change, and a lot of the things, and I guess reality TV could certainly contribute to that, that we're in a media situation where we're inundated with lots of change. Social media, we have too much information, and technology is changing far faster than humans are. I mean, there's some fascinating research on how technology is changing at a rate that's 1,000 times the rate of human systems change. And so the question is, in an environment of technology and in social media and reality TV, how come we still have change problems? And my answer to that is, a lot of the change that we experience, especially with technology, is that technology and change makes our lives easier, right? I hardly ever log on my desktop computer. I can do my banking from my phone, and pretty much everything you can do from a device nowadays. So technology makes our lives easier. So we have this illusion that change makes our life easier and more convenient and more efficient. You know, when's the last time you've written a check? Right? We can text each other money now with Venmo and the Cash App and Zelle and things like that. So technology makes our lives easier. So we have this illusion that change makes your life easier. In organizations and in human systems, change is harder. And so we cannot apply the same type of change mindset of technology to our organizational change because it's harder. At the end of the day, people don't like to really change organizational habits. So I think it's about knowing that some change makes our lives easier, but we can't expect change in general to make our lives easier in organizational systems and changing organizational habits. It's a great question, by the way. Thank you, Las Vegas. I hope you have enjoyed the principles. Again, this is just kind of a taste of the principles, and I appreciate you guys dedicating so much time to focusing on a computer screen and learning. So thank you, Las Vegas. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you. And for the rest of you folks in around the Nevada area from the different sites, thank you so much for spending some time with me. And I know we have some people from Reno, I think. Oh, it says right there, Reno and Carson City. I hope you guys have enjoyed the presentation. I hope you enjoy the principles, and if there's anything I can do to help you in the future, just feel free to email me at glenn@acji.org, or you can email allison@acji.org, or go to our website or give us a call, and we're happy to help out any way that we can. So I'm very passionate about this material, and it really is based on the real world. So thank you all. Appreciate that. So I'll go ahead and terminate the webinar. Thank you everybody so much for listening. Thank you so much for dedicating time. I know it's hard on webinar format sometimes, but again, we're always here to help you if you need anything, and we enjoy talking about this material and culture change and all those things. So we're gonna go ahead and terminate the webinar, and thank you all. Good luck with your work. You're doing the right thing, and little by little, this criminal justice system will get better. I very much believe it, and thank you all for your leadership and your work.